This Health Ranger Report Pandemic Podcast is brought to you by NaturalNews.com for uncensored reporting and HealthRangerStore.com for lab-tested preparedness supplies such as storable food, full-face medical masks, biostructured silver first aid gel, and iodine, only while supplies last. Welcome to this special Natural News Report, the 10 stages of coronavirus. I'm Mike Adams, the publisher of Natural News and the creator of these 10 stages. The purpose of this is to help us understand realistic projections of where things are headed and the cycles of resurgence that we are likely to experience. This is being recorded on April 27th, 2020. We are right now just past the so-called peak of deaths in the United States, mostly on the East Coast, New York City area. We are in what's called a flattening of the curve right now, hoping for a decline to kick in shortly. Deaths in the United States have been officially at anywhere between about 1,800 and 2,800 per day for the past 2 weeks. We're at over 55,000 deaths total right now and clearly headed for something like 70,000 by the end of next month. So how did we get here and where are we going from here? These are the key questions. Now, just as a matter of record, in early March, when no one had yet initiated lockdown orders anywhere in America, we ran projections and publicly warned the president and governors that they would have to have lockdowns. Otherwise, we were on track for 2.16 million deaths in the United States by early July. The projections that we released in early March showed 580 deaths by April 5th and over 10,000 deaths by May 5th. At the time that we released those numbers, everybody thought they were insane. People thought that's impossible. There's no way we could have 500 deaths by April 5th, when in fact we already had a lot more, thousands of deaths by that time. And no one thought we could have 10,000 deaths by May 5th, even though here we are still in April already at 10 times that number, over 55,000 deaths. Well, it turns out that our numbers were too conservative. So when I say there were going to be 2.16 million deaths by July 4th, if we had not started social distancing and lockdowns and quarantine efforts and so on, trust me when I say those numbers were low. Those initial projections we put out showed 80,000 deaths per day around July 4th. And it would have been devastating to the United States of America to see literally millions of people die this summer. And that's exactly where we were headed. So fortunately, other people could also see where this was headed and the lockdowns began. So there is a tremendous amount of credit due to President Trump, as well as governors of states that initiated the lockdowns. Over 2 million deaths were averted by those decisions. And yet, here we are in America today with now this left-right paradigm where the left, it seems, wants to keep everything locked down forever until there are no new infections. And the right wants to end all lockdowns and doesn't think any lockdowns were ever necessary. And for the most part, conservatives and pro-Trump supporters believe that the virus is no more dangerous than the flu and that it isn't really killing anybody. Of course, that's absurd. We already know, based on a Financial Times mortuary records analysis from all over the world, as well as Yale scientists, we know that the official death statistics are underreporting deaths all around the world. The Financial Times looked at morbidities from all causes, regardless of what's mentioned on death certificates. And the Financial Times found that there should be really right now about 300,000 deaths worldwide attributed to the coronavirus, not the 200,000, which is the official number as of today. And what this really shows us is that there are about 3 million confirmed infections around the world right now and 300,000 deaths. The case fatality rate looks to be about 10%, which is 100 times higher than the regular flu, which comes in at 0.1%, or about 1 in 1,000 people who are symptomatic die from the flu. And by the way, there's been a lot of confusion out there about the so-called case fatality rate, CFR, versus the infection fatality rate, IFR. A lot of people have been confusing those two and comparing, for example, the IFR of coronavirus versus the CFR of the seasonal flu. Well, that's comparing apples to oranges. So when we say that 1 out of 1,000 people die from the flu, that's 1 out of 1,000 people who show symptoms and who are diagnosed with the flu. If you consider everyone who's been infected with the flu, then it's really only 1 in about 4,000 people who die. Because every year in America, about 140 million people are infected with the flu, but only about 35 million become symptomatic and are considered flu cases. Out of those 35 million, about 35,000 die, which is about 1 in 1,000. Now, let me add one more thing. When the lockdowns began to be put in place in mid-March, by the end of March, we had modified our original projections to then project from 46,000 to 91,000 deaths in the United States by the end of July. This is at a time when the White House was officially projecting 100,000 to 240,000 deaths for that same time period. We ran our numbers based on the new social distancing factors. I'm using a rather advanced, updated spreadsheet for modeling with lag times, asymptomatic carriers, and day-to-day social distancing factors that are put into the model. And that model churned out results that told me we're going to be anywhere from 46,000 to 91,000 deaths in the aggregate in the United States by the end of July. Well, a few days ago, we already passed the 46,000 mark. Again, as of this recording, we're at 55,000. So that projection has already turned out to be true and accurate. So we really have a track record of being incredibly accurate with the numbers, even though we have a wide margin of confidence or certainty, you might say. 46,000 to 91,000 is a pretty wide range. The reason for this is because it depends on how society responds. It depends on whether the lockdowns are ended, for example, with mandatory mask policies or without mandatory mask policies. It depends a lot on how the people react to this. Do the people abide by social distancing measures? Do the people take zinc and vitamin C and vitamin D and boost their immune function? Do people sanitize surfaces, especially shared public surfaces such as door handles and buttons in elevators and car handles on taxi cabs and things like that? If a lot of precautions are taken, then the future looks relatively good. But if the precautions are ignored, then the future looks rather dire. So with that as background, let's get into the 10 stages of coronavirus so we can see where we are headed right now, because there's a very good chance, as I'll explain here, that we are headed to collapse by sometime next year. And I'll define what I mean by collapse, but basically it is a geopolitical collapse, a financial collapse, a collapse in public faith, and a collapse of the social order. But how did we get there? Well, we started in January with stage 1, avoidance. This was the time during which President Trump was imagining that this would all go away overnight. I think he said something like, you'll wake up one day and it'll just be gone. And at some point, I remember there were 15 infections in the United States, and Trump said, it's only 15. It's going to go down to 0. Of course, now we're at over 1 million infections in the United States. So clearly the avoidance strategy was not effective. In February and March, then we went into acceleration. So while everybody was telling America that everything's fine, including Nancy Pelosi out in California and government workers in New York City, everything's fine, ride the subway, go out to the theater, enjoy Chinatown, this and that. And Trump was also saying there's no problem, keep the stock market high. So during this time, the virus was doubling about every 3.5 days because no one was wearing masks, no one was really taking precautions. And without mitigation factors, it's quite clear that this virus, based on its R0 value and social behavior, that it doubles about every 3.5 days in typical US cities. So that means it quadruples every week because it doubles twice in 1 week. So what started out as, let's say, 10 infections, a week later became roughly 40, and then a week later became 160, and so on. So this was the pace at which it was doubling, about every 3.5 days. Because of the exponential nature of that, we then went into the surge. The surge started happening in March. By about March 10th or so, even the president could no longer ignore it. And this was a time when I was screaming publicly in the alternative media that if we did not do something, there would be millions of deaths by July 4th. And I think because myself and others raised this alarm, finally there was some action taken to initiate the lockdowns. So the lockdowns began between about March 15th and March 20th. From there was a lag time of continued surge, continued hospitalizations and deaths, that extended through the end of March and into the first half of April. The lockdowns, for them to work, it takes about 30 days of lag time. So, in other words, you've already got a lot of people infected. Even if you initiate the lockdowns, many people are already infected and on track to becoming critical or serious patients or dead. And so they ended up in the hospitals weeks later. This was what happened in New York City, where normally in New York City, about 440 people die every day in a normal year from all causes combined. On some days in New York City, the number of deaths was 800. And for many days, it was 700. Oh, and those were deaths just from COVID-19. So if you look at deaths from all causes in New York City during those days, of course, it's going to be 800 plus 400 something, although there is a suppression of deaths from other causes, such as workplace accidents and traffic accidents and so on. So if you really look at the number of deaths attributable to coronavirus by itself, it's very easy to underestimate those numbers. And this is what a Financial Times analysis found and Yale scientists and so on. But in any case, deaths in New York were skyrocketing beyond any normal March or April from any previous year. So we know that something was killing lots and lots of people. And it was happening in New York and Italy and Madrid, and it was happening in Guayaquil, Ecuador, and it was happening in other countries. It was even happening in Sweden, by the way, which saw a huge increase in total mortalities. So what did all these events have in common? Of course, coronavirus infections, all at about the same time, second half of March, first half of April, and now extending through the end of April as well. So we are right now at what's called the flattening phase, which is where we have this seemingly sustained level of deaths that are really higher than what any of us would want to see, of course, but it hasn't yet begun to really drop off. However, because the lockdowns have continued through April, we are definitely going to see a decline. So the fifth stage of this is the decline stage, and that's going to be May and June. Now, during this stage, the arguments from people on the right are going to be, oh, well, look, millions didn't die. The lockdowns, therefore, weren't necessary, and we should never have lockdowns again, and no one needs to wear a mask. So those arguments, you're going to see them really proliferate through May and June, especially across independent media, pro-Trump media, and conservative media. And that's going to lead to June and July complacency, which I'll talk about in a second. Now, people who are scientists or epidemiologists or virologists or just people who understand math know that actually the decline we're experiencing now is because we had the lockdowns. Without the lockdowns, we would have continued into exponential explosions of fatalities. And right now, on the day that I'm recording this, instead of seeing, I don't know, somewhere between 1,000 and 2,000 deaths in the United States, we would be seeing more like 4,000 to 5,000 deaths. And if we had not done the lockdowns, those deaths would, in May, have reached 10,000 deaths a day. And then in June, even more, 20,000 deaths a day, 40,000 deaths a day. By the time July got around, it would have been 80,000 deaths a day. I knew that would never happen, though, and I stated so in the early projections because I said there's no way that Trump or any governors will allow this to happen. Because even if you say you want to prioritize the economy, you can't run an economy on dead people. And if you have millions of people dead by July, and then in August, you might have over 10 million people dead if that had continued. That would have been a national disaster, far worse than locking down the country for 6 weeks. So the interesting thing to note about this is that people who say the lockdowns weren't necessary are people who are unable to see things that didn't happen. They can't count the deaths that were averted because they didn't see them. I've used this explanation. It's kind of like if they have a small fire in the kitchen of their home, and then they call the fire department, and the fire department comes over and puts out the small fire in the kitchen, averting the entire house burning down. Then those people would say, well, gosh, we didn't need to call the fire department. The house didn't burn down, you see? So it's hard for some people to imagine things that didn't happen, especially when there's a political reason to not want to imagine those things. And also there's a psychological phenomenon going on right now, which is known as the 5 stages of grief. A lot of people are psychologically or neurologically shocked by what's happening. And so those 5 stages that they're going through start with denialism when they say, oh, this isn't happening. And I've even done another very interesting podcast on the 5 stages of grief, which is something that we all need to recognize in order to deal with people who are in those stages, such as denial, or the second stage is anger, where they're lashing out. They're angry about everything that's happening, which is understandable because people are losing their jobs and people are losing their careers and their small businesses and their futures, maybe their pension funds, things like that. So of course there's a lot of people who are angry, but it is a stage of coping. And then the next stage is bargaining, where people say, oh, uh, sometimes they bargain with God and say, oh God, if you'll uh, give me my business back, then I promise never to whatever gamble again, or whatever sins people think that they need to pay for, spiritually speaking. But anyway, that's a separate conversation. I don't want to confuse the 10 stages of the coronavirus here with the 5 stages of grief, even though both of these timelines are, in fact, tracking at the same time. So now we get to the complacency stage. You see, the success of the lockdowns will lead a lot of people to complacency because they have difficulty imagining things that did not happen. And since there's been a lot of disinformation, even put out by the government in the early days, to say that masks don't work, and therefore you, the public, should never buy them so that we, the government, can hoard all the mask supplies, right? Remember that? The Surgeon General even was out there saying, stop buying masks, everybody. They don't work for you. They only work for us in the hospitals, Very bad disinformation. And sadly, that disinformation has a cost. It causes confusion in the minds of people to the point where even right now, many Americans believe that masks even increase the risk of infections rather than decreasing them. So there has been concerted disinformation propaganda from the government, but also from other independent media sources as well, or even mainstream conservative media sources, such as Rush Limbaugh, for example, who has really been an agent of disinformation on this from February. And that's because he is, just bluntly stated, scientifically illiterate. And we would have been much better off to listen to other conservative radio hosts like Michael Savage, who has a doctorate in epidemiology and actually has been right about this from day one. In fact, Michael Savage and I tend to agree on almost every point about what's happening right now. And we are very, very frustrated with the lack of mathematical literacy and scientific literacy among many others who are not able to accurately assess the data here and understand what's happening. Exponential math in particular is very difficult for a lot of people to follow. So it's hard for people to imagine how quickly things can explode when exponential math is in play. So that's going to lead to a lot of complacency in June and July. There will probably be a resurgence in the stock market during this time. And a lot of people are going to be convinced that things are back on track, that it was a bounce back from the stock market problems, that the virus isn't overrunning any hospitals anywhere in America, that the surge is over, the curve is flattened, and probably the market will even be booming during this time, and many businesses will be getting back on track, and many people who are sitting at home will be able to get back to work. Now, the key here is how strict the states are in their reopening plans. We've seen reopening plans so far from Ohio and Texas and other states, and so far the plans have been pretty good, better than I had expected. It looks like governors across the nation are going to be recommending that people wear masks in public when they go into retail stores, for example, or movie theaters, and that the openings are going to be limited to limit the density of people. For example, you might be able to go to a movie, but you'll have to sit at 1/4 current capacity, or restaurants might be open, but seating only for 1/3 or 1/4 of the normal capacity. And that's a temporary measure. And from what I've seen so far, for example, from Governor Abbott in Texas, those kinds of measures are going to be put in place for a couple of weeks, and then to look at the numbers and make sure that there isn't some new exponential explosion taking place. If things are working, then they can relax those even more. So there will be an ongoing relaxation of the aggressiveness of the social distancing measures and mask mandates and so on, which makes a lot of sense. It really does make sense to do something for 2 weeks that's pretty strict. In other words, to err on the side of caution. And then if that looks good, loosen it up a little bit more, try another 2-week block, see how that goes, and then maybe loosen it up a little bit more after that. And piece by piece, we can get America's economy open again without just rolling the dice and playing, Russian roulette with America by saying, oh, end all lockdowns, everybody just go back to the theaters, back to the bars, back to the fitness centers, and let's just see what happens. That's not a very wise response, and it's not responsible. And we're not actually seeing that happening, which is a good thing. So basically, thumbs up right now to the governors of the various states who are exercising a lot of caution. But the real question here, and this is what's going to determine what happens for the final four phases. And I've marked on my infographic that there's increasing uncertainty for the last four phases. Those phases could go very well, or they could go very poorly. It depends on what the people do. What about the American people? Because I've seen public protests, mostly by pro-Trump conservatives, where they refuse to wear masks. So the question is, are these people going to refuse to wear masks in retail stores? Are they going to refuse to practice social distancing? Are they going to refuse to use hand sanitizers where it makes sense? Are they going to basically refuse to abide by any of these precautions? If that's the case, then we're going to head into a resurgence in August and September. And that's stage 7, resurgence. So there's a very strong possibility of resurgence, not only because people might fail to abide by the precautions that are set out for them by governors and the president, potentially, but also because the R naught value of this virus really is very, very high. This virus is highly transmissible. The R naught value is definitely higher than 3.0, might be as high as 6.6, something in that neighborhood. It is incredibly easy to catch, especially in shared indoor environments, such as grocery stores, retail locations, movie theaters, and all these places where people tend to congregate. It can also include, of course, airplanes, buses, subways, and transportation infrastructure. In fact, I think that's where it spread very rapidly in New York City. So the real question comes down to how well will the people abide by these precautions? And it looks like right now, people who live in Democrat cities are going to be more obedient or compliant with many of these suggestions. Whereas conservatives who live in more conservative states or rural areas are going to be a lot less compliant. Now, there is a natural protection mechanism in rural areas, which is the fact that people tend to drive their own cars. They don't take public transportation very much. They don't have shared buses and so on. And they have more sunshine, more rural living, more outdoors. So that's a natural protection. But if those people then congregate in bars or retail outlets or government buildings or stadiums or anything like that, there could be a very high risk of transmission even in rural areas, especially if there's not good compliance by rural Americans. Because I don't know, for some reason, it has become a thing where conservatives now think that wearing a mask is surrendering to tyranny, which is very odd because many of those people used to be preppers who gathered up a lot of prepping gear, such as firearms and ammunition, gold and silver, gas masks, getting ready for bioweapons or chemical attacks or EMP, grid down failures, things like that. I mean, I'm a prepper too. I have lots of different types of gear. I never in my life ever said, oh, I'm going to choose not to wear any of this gear when it's appropriate. If there's a pandemic, that's what masks are for. Just like if the grid goes down and the lights are out, you have a flashlight. It would be very strange for people to say flashlights are bad when the lights are out. Flashlights are horrible, just like it would be strange for, firefighters to decide that wearing helmets and fireproof fire jackets is a bad idea when fighting a fire. You use the gear that's appropriate for the circumstances. And when it comes to a transmissible airborne disease that comes out of people's mouths when they talk, the more people wear masks, the better. But that's a whole different conversation. It does, however, get to the idea here of what happens in the last four stages really depends a lot on whether the people act like adults or if they become frustrated with the recommendations and decide to act out of resistance and just say, well, I'm not going to practice social distancing. I'm not going to wear a mask. I'm not going to wash my hands. Which is just, I can't even believe we're even having this kind of conversation in our country these days. I thought public sanitation was always a good idea, but it's all become political. So, of course, rationality has been thrown out the window at this point. But I'm going to be wearing a mask with an American flag on it, or a mask that says something like, come and take it, because personally I'm pro Second Amendment, but I also understand infectious disease. So I'll have a mask and a concealed weapon because, hey, I live in Texas, and that's one way that we prepare. Now, moving into the last three phases, if the resurgence is strong, because again of non-compliance, which, by the way, I think may happen more in conservative states than in liberal states, but we'll have to wait and see, then by September to October, I think we're going to experience a moment of renewed panic. And it will be a financial panic as much as a psychological panic of people realizing that new lockdowns are coming. So if there are new lockdowns, and if the market has a major correction because people realize the economic damage is not limited to just a 6-week dip, that this economic damage is going to take years to recover from. Some businesses are gone forever, and unemployment is still sky high. How can the stock market continue to have these unrealistic valuations based mostly on money printing by the Federal Reserve, by the way? How can that continue when in reality there are still, let's say, 25 million Americans out of work, whatever the number is at that time? I think that September through October is going to be the panic time, again, if we don't have good compliance, with masks and social distancing and so on. So renewed numbers of hospitalizations and deaths, maybe not as high as we had in April, but still high enough to cause concern. Renewed lockdowns at some level, maybe at a certain city, maybe certain counties, maybe some states, but also then a new reality check of what's happening in the financial markets. And October, notably, of course, that's the month that a lot of black swan stock market corrections take place, like October 19th, 1987, by the way, one of the first so-called flash crashes of our modern era. They crashed, I think, 20% in one day without any rational explanation, just crashed. There wasn't even a reason behind it except for the fact that there was a lot of trading rules put in place and positive feedback loops that kicked in and sort of launched more selling that then caused even more selling and so on. It became a bad scene. But October is typically a very risky time for the stock market every year. Now, if we get that worst case scenario, and this is where the uncertainty is very high, if people comply with the rules and practice social distancing, then we won't have the chaos that I currently have noted here as stage 9. But if we don't have good compliance and people are careless, we're going to have chaos. Chaos is also encompassing the political ramifications of what happens in the elections. If the elections are mostly vote by mail, and if that vote by mail causes a Democrat to win, which at this moment seems likely, I'm currently estimating that President Trump has a 4 in 5 chance of losing, based on current events, of course, subject to change, but right now doesn't look good for the president. If the vote by mail election causes Trump to lose, it's very clear to me that conservative America absolutely will not accept the outcome of that election. And what I see is not just protests, but riots, armed uprisings. I see a nation split after the election. I see the election being questioned, frankly, by either side, because if Trump wins the election, of course, it seems likely that Democrats will find some reason to say, oh, the Russians did it again. Or who knows who they'll say is responsible this time. Oh, the Ukrainians stole the election for Trump. Or they'll say the Chinese. I mean, who knows? Or they'll come up with some other reason. They'll say the vote was suppressed in liberal cities, perhaps because of the pandemic. I mean, whatever. They're going to come up with a reason. The point is not to pick one side or the other here. The point is that I don't think either side will accept the outcome of this election. I think we are beyond the tipping point of the United States of America remaining united. Think about this. What if we have another situation where Joe Biden wins the popular vote, but President Trump wins the Electoral College? What's going to happen then? Of course, people on the left are going to lose their minds over the Electoral College again, and they're going to try to perhaps unleash riots, unleash chaos, unleash a revolution, something like that. But again, it's not just the left. I see Trump supporters unleashing riots and possible chaos and possible armed uprising if their candidate loses. My point is that either way, we are probably headed toward chaos, especially if we're coming off a market crash in October. We're coming off panic and fear and uncertainty. And by the way, the other thing that's in this mix is a collapse of the food supply. So the food supply chain is breaking down, even according to Tyson Foods. Meat plants are shutting down all across America. There's also another factor a lot of people haven't considered, which is the honeybee pollinators of crops in California. The pollinators haven't been able to do their jobs because the beekeepers haven't been allowed to travel around with their beehives and pollinate almond orchards and pear orchards and all the different food crops that require pollinators. A lot of that pollination hasn't happened during the springtime when it was supposed to happen. That means we're going to have massive crop failures or shortages later this year. So about 1/3 of the food that's on your plate in America in normal times comes from a plant that was pollinated by, a honeybee or a bumblebee or something like that. And that has been strongly curtailed this year. So when you head into the panic phase here and then the chaos phase, what worsens the chaos is uncertainty stemming from a financial crash, a food supply crash, personal uncertainty about financial futures and job security, even food security for that matter. But uncertainty and fear leads to chaos and uprisings and revolutions. And when you combine all of that with the extreme polarization that now exists in the United States, the political polarization, where people on the left right now are saying, oh, they hope Trump supporters drink bleach and die. And then some people on the right are, ready to march and shoot people, I suppose, if they have to be locked down one more week. There's a lot of tension in the system. And depending on what happens between now and then, that tension could really be unleashed right after the elections. So when it comes to the day after the election in early November, it's going to become apparent to a lot of Americans that their perceived future has been obliterated. So people on the left, if they see Trump win again, they're going to think their world has imploded, everything's collapsed, that America is over. In their minds, it's, Hitler as president. And conservatives are going to see if Joe Biden becomes president, the Alzheimer's patient, then the future of America is also destroyed. America's going to revert to socialism and increased fascism, high taxation, gun confiscation, forced vaccination, government surveillance of everybody's health status. It's going to be basically a 1984 Orwellian nightmare under Democrat control, with, of course, China running the tech giants to enforce mass censorship, especially censorship of conservatives and Trump supporters. And by the way, just for the record, I've been outspoken about that for all this time as well. Trump has done seemingly nothing to stop the censorship of the tech giants. So I'm not even sure how Trump expects to win if his own supporters have never been allowed to speak for the last couple of years, because the tech giants ban Trump supporters for saying basically anything that's pro-America or pro-Trump. But I guess that's another conversation. Now, finally, the last stage of this is collapse. And by collapse, it is financial collapse, the stock market, which is a Ponzi scheme, by the way. It is a currency collapse. Now, that may not happen in 2021, but it will be initiated. Actually, it's already been initiated by the Federal Reserve, taking on, $10 trillion almost now in its balance sheet, printing trillions of dollars, bailout money going to rich, wealthy corporations. This is a fourth turning type of moment where the American people, both left and right, are losing faith in the institutions. Who trusts the banks at this point? Who trusts the CDC? Who trusts Dr. Fauci? Well, maybe a lot of people on the left do, but conservatives certainly don't. But who trusts the president? The people on the left have zero trust of the president. Trust in the institutions is collapsing, including, of course, media and academia in many ways because of the fraud of the pharmaceutical industry that, by the way, is going to great lengths to suppress the truth about hydroxychloroquine or remdesivir or other drugs that might be useful right now. They're all being suppressed and attacked by big pharma in order to clear the way for a vaccine. So a lot of this is leading to a vaccine push long term. But people are losing faith in the institutions, and that's what leads to revolutions and collapse. So when I say collapse, I'm talking about really a collapse of society as it is currently structured. The United States of America may no longer exist beyond 2021. It may be fractured. There may be a parallel shadow government. I can see if Trump wins, the Democrats might just say, we're just going to set up our own White House in Los Angeles or wherever, or New York. We're just going to have our own Congress. We're just going to have a parallel government. I could see them doing that and just saying that we can't coexist, they might say, with Trump voters. You know, those people and their Bibles and their guns, you know, how they like to mock people who believe in God or who believe in the Second Amendment and so on. So they might just set up their own parallel government, and then we have a massive fracturing, basically on track to a civil war. So it's a cultural fracturing, it's a financial fracturing, it's a geopolitical fracturing, and also health and medicine, because right now Big Pharma has a stranglehold over America, whereas more and more people on both the left and the right are discovering the power of nutrition, zinc and vitamin C and elderberry and vitamin D and turmeric and all these things, the licorice root, these natural antivirals. Even there's been a lot of new discussion, although I know it's controversial, about chlorine dioxide, which is being banned everywhere. You can't even find science papers on chlorine dioxide now. They're being retroactively removed from science journals. I mean, this is classic Orwellian 1984 Ministry of Truth revisionist history stuff that's going on right now. And of course, colloidal silver is in much the same boat. So a lot of suppression of possible alternative treatments that should be tested. I've called for testing of everything, every herb, every Chinese medicine, every nutrient, every superfood, every, therapeutic substance like colloidal silver, but none of that's happening. America is being told to suffer and stay locked down to get the country prepared for mass vaccination programs, which I've covered in other podcasts, so I'm not going to go into huge details here. But basically, it is mandatory vaccines, it's medical tyranny, it's a big pharma police state. And you're going to be marked and tagged like cattle. You're going to be branded and barcoded or RFID tagged, mark of the beast, whatever you want to call it. There's going to be some kind of a Bill Gates run, automatic tracking system of your antibodies and your blood and your vaccine status, and you're going to be denied access to public transportation or a job or a government position or medical school or whatever if you don't have the right type of blood, whatever the government decides that is. That you have to have these certain protein sequences in your blood, or you are not a citizen any longer, which is also interesting because, of the open borders policies and how progressives like to say, well, illegal aliens can come in, i.e. undocumented immigrants, and they should be considered Americans. But if you are born in America and you have the wrong blood, you will be kicked out of society. So that's a whole interesting debate that's coming, by the way. Just pointing that out, not trying to actually carry on the debate right here, but just pointing out that those are some of the issues. So basically, collapse could mean the collapse of the United States of America as we know it, collapse of the dollar, collapse of the fiat currency, although it probably will take more years for that to happen. But we could certainly experience a collapse in public faith in the very institution of government, especially after this next election. So there's a very high probability, in my opinion, if there is complacency in June and July, if Americans don't abide by the mask rules, and if there's a lot of new spread of this infection, then the resurgence will lead to uncertainty and stock market collapse and new lockdown panic, and that will feed into the election chaos and the post-election uprisings, possibly leading to civil war, instability, loss of faith in public institutions, and a fracturing of everything that defines this society. And that's the scenario for 2021 that I hope we avoid, by the way. So this And by the way, this isn't even the worst case scenario. This is, I think, kind of a middle of the road scenario. Worst case is, well, it involves America being invaded by China. I'll just put it that way. It's way worse than a civil war. It's World War III. That in our moment of weakness, enemies of America would exploit that in order to try to destroy and overrun and occupy our country and mass slaughter the American people. All right. But I don't have time to talk about that right here. I've talked about that in other podcasts. The best case scenario is that we beat the virus using masks and using common sense approaches, good nutrition, protecting the elderly, but allowing younger people to get back to work. The economy bounces back. The stock market bounces back, even though it's a Ponzi scheme, by the way. So it would just be a false reinflation of a bubble, by the way. But in the best case scenario, we don't end up in panic in September and October. We end up in confidence. And then by November, December, instead of chaos, we have calm. And then 2021, we have, economic recovery and abundance and so on. So that is the sort of best case. I think it's a fairy tale scenario, but it is possible. The further out we go in the future, the higher the level of uncertainty we have about where this is headed. So what do you think is going to happen? That's my question to you. Between now and November, a lot of things could change. A lot of things in finance and geopolitics and national security and biological weapons. Perhaps a second weapon might be released against the United States by China. Who knows? There are so many wild cards in the system right now, so many black swans, that it's a little risky for me to even put out the 10 stages of coronavirus like this and even attempt to look at them. Because the bracketing of events now, you have to take into account like 50 sigma type of uncertainty levels. Like crazy things could happen. Aliens show up, meteors strike, volcanoes go off. This is the kind of world that it seems like we're in right now. So I don't know for certain what's going to happen in those final 4 months, but I do know that if we had done nothing last month, we would have witnessed millions of Americans die by the summer. So I'm glad we averted that. I'm concerned about the complacency. I'm very concerned about the scientific illiteracy that seems to be commonplace in the media. That's very concerning. It sort of reiterates why we need more basic science education in America, or even just mathematical education, I suppose. But again, that's another debate, another topic. I'm very concerned that the complacency is going to lead to a resurgence of infections, but we don't know how high that's going to go. It may be much higher. This may be like Spanish flu, 1918. By the time the winter comes around, we could be looking at an order of magnitude more infections and deaths. Instead of just, let's say, 70,000 people dying, we could conceivably, although I don't think this is the most likely scenario, but it's possible, we could see, 500,000 or even 700,000 people die over the next winter if things get out of control. I hope that's not the case. I don't think it is the case, but it's possible. We are dealing with a biological weapon here. And if we let our guard down, it will bite us hard. This thing has no mercy for us. No mercy. If we let down our guard for just 1 month, it will reestablish itself and it will have a new exponential explosion in infections. And things will look great for a while. Through May and June, and maybe part of July, people will be celebrating, oh, we beat this thing, it's over. We never have to deal with it again. And then it can come right back in August and September. And that's going to be mentally crushing to the population. Just the psychological assault of saying, oh my God, no way, I can't go into lockdowns again. No, we can't take another economic hit again. I should have called, maybe instead of panic, the September, October timeframe, I should have called it more like despair. In fact, maybe I will just change. Yeah, I'm going to change that name. I'm going to call it despair. So maybe by the time you see this, it will say despair. I think that's actually a better term, because people will think, we already went through this. I thought we beat this thing. I thought this was over. I thought the economy bounced back. I thought everything was solved, but I don't think it's going to be solved that easily. So despair can lead to chaos, can lead to collapse. That's where we might be. So we'll just have to pay attention. Now, of course, I will continue to offer you my honest analysis at naturalnews.com and also pandemic.news. My name is Mike Adams, the Health Ranger, and just for the record, I am taking a lot of heat right now from independent media and conservative media for not going along with the crowd. The crowd is saying the virus isn't real, or it's no big deal, or it's just a media hoax to try to hurt Trump, and so on. I mean, people are accusing me of joining the Democrats for some reason. I have no idea why. Look, I'm not into tribalism. I'm I've never even described myself as a Republican. I'm not part of a pro-Trump cult, nor an anti-Trump cult. I'm here to try to save lives. I'm trying to give people good information so that we can avert the millions of deaths and the worst case scenarios. That's my goal. And bottom line is I do not conform to the consensus. I don't follow the madness of crowds. I'm not interested in being liked by a mob of mindless people. I'm only interested in helping America survive with both our health and our liberties intact. Yes, I'm pro-life. I believe in protecting life. Yes, I'm pro-liberty. Yes, I'm pro-Second Amendment. But those things do not shut off the rational side of my brain when it comes to looking at infectious disease or epidemiology. And if Trump is being stupid, I will say it, just as I did in February when he was acting like this was no big deal. Frankly, if President Trump had listened to me, we wouldn't be in this position right now. We wouldn't even have 55,000 deaths. He could have kept the deaths down below 10,000 if he had listened to me, or others like me, such as Michael Savage and so on. We could have averted even more deaths. But then again, had he acted, a week later, we might be looking at 250,000 deaths, quadruple the number that we're expecting just in 1 week, because remember, it doubles every 3.5 days. So Trump acted early enough to avert millions of deaths, but too late to avert maybe 100,000 deaths or wherever we end up by the end of July. Maybe it'll be 80,000, something in that range. So, I guess you can blame Trump or you can congratulate Trump. The point is, I knew we were going to lock down America sooner or later. The only question was how many people are going to die. In other words, how late do you want to do the lockdown? If you keep waiting, it's just going to be a lot more dead. You're going to lock down the country eventually because you can't run an economy on dead people. So why not lock down the country earlier, get the virus defeated, save a lot of lives, get this over with so that we can get back on track earlier? You see, that was my argument in February, but Trump didn't listen. And so if Trump does something stupid, I'm happy to point that out. Or if he does something good, I'm happy to point that out. I'm not a Trump cultist. And whether Trump wins or loses, I'm still going to argue for the same principles here. And by the way, just as a last little, political note, where are all the people who are criticizing Obama for government debt spending? Because now, under Trump, we have blown away Obama's debt spending. There's no comparison. We're close to $25 trillion in debt in Trump's first term. And I think Obama, didn't he leave office when we were at about 16 trillion or 17 trillion, something in that range? Now we're at almost 25 in Trump's first term. And the Federal Reserve is owning and buying the corporate bonds and equities, it looks like, will be happening soon in exchange for bailout money. And I thought conservatives oppose fascism. That is, governments owning the corporations, governments owning the means of production. That's the definition of fascism, and it's happening under Trump. So I'm going to be honest about what's happening. If I see the government owning the means of production, and that's the definition of fascism, I'm going to point it out. And look, fascism is taking place. Look, bailout money is being used to allow the government to dictate the winners and losers in the market. The market is rigged. The currency is going to be worthless. Doesn't matter who's president. This is a fiat currency, eventually a hyperinflation blowout. So I will speak honestly about these things because I have principle. I stand for principles, not candidates. I don't give a crap about the name of the person in the White House. I care about their policies because I stand on principle. And those principles are very simple: protecting life, protecting liberty, supporting human awareness, awakening, knowledge, individual thinking, all of these things. And I've been consistent the whole time For the last 20 years, I've been consistent on these principles. And sometimes the mob loves my principles, and other times the mob hates my principles. Well, guess what? I don't bow down to any mob. In fact, I despise mobs. That's why I live on a ranch in Texas, away from the mob, because to me, principles are more important. Morals and ethics. What do you stand for? Not what gang are you a member of? You see what I'm saying? I'm not here to be part of a tribe, unless you want to say the pro-human tribe. Yeah, I'm pro-human. I'm not some political tribalist, though. You're not going to see me waving a flag for some party that is corrupt, no matter which party you choose, it seems. I wave the flag for humanity. I wave the flag for truth and for freedom and protecting life. And sometimes we have to make difficult decisions about how to do all of those things at the same time, such as going through these temporary lockdowns in order to reopen the economy with precautions and restore society. But I can't believe the short patience that many Americans have had in all of this. They can't even handle a 6-week lockdown. The average American worker doesn't have 1 month of backup money. And the answer is no, they don't. They panic in about a month. They can't pay rent in 1 month. So we have bigger problems in society than just this current debate. We have a problem with a lack of savings. We have a problem with too much spending and too much consumerism and many other similar problems that are way beyond the scope of this particular podcast. But I hope we have a discussion about those things, because a society that's always living on the edge, highly leveraged, too much debt, too much consumerism, that is a society that has no redundancy. That is a fragile society, not a resilient society. And what we need is an anti-fragile society. In other words, a highly resilient society. Decentralization, local food supplies. More people should be growing food locally. Decentralization of government, decentralization of the money supply. Even, why does the Federal Reserve get to counterfeit money endlessly? Just create money out of thin air and bail out their favored bankers in New York and Connecticut. What's that all about? That's not American. That's not honest. Shouldn't even be legal. Why was Glass-Steagall repealed? I think in 1998 or somewhere around there during the Clinton administration. What happened? See, these are other conversations we need to have as a society. But make no mistake, we are not living in a society that is adaptive, that is responsive, that is resilient, that has any real forward thinking. We're not living in a society that has high scientific literacy, mathematical literacy, or even really high compassion. Some people are out there saying, hey, sacrifice the elderly, reopen the economy, just let all the old people die. That's not American. I'm sorry. That's not even human. We don't sacrifice the elderly as Americans. No, we take care of our elders because they have more wisdom than we do, by the way. They've lived longer than us. They've seen things that we haven't seen. Some of them alive today they lived through the Great Depression. They can tell you things that are about to happen that most young Americans would never imagine in their lifetimes. They thought the Great Depression was some ancient history thing that would never happen again because CNBC's Jim Cramer told them to buy the dip and you'll all get rich. You'll all retire as millionaires or billionaires. I think most young people living in Silicon Valley actually thought that was the case. They need to go talk to grandma about the reality of living in the Great Depression. How if one person is eating a bowl of bean soup and doesn't want the bacon fat, then you put the bacon fat back in the pot because you can't waste bacon fat when you're living in a Great Depression. And the reason I mentioned that as an example is because that's a story that my grandmother, who's 102 years old, told me. She's still living, by the way. 102. Born in 1918. Lived through the Great Depression. Lived in a tent following the Great Depression. So yeah, I've heard the stories. And most people living today have never heard those stories or have never imagined that reality might be coming to them soon. Because if the worst case scenario occurs here of what I'm describing in these 10 stages of coronavirus, we're talking about mass homelessness, okay? People who are going to be kicked out of their homes and apartments, living on the streets in boxes and tents. The rise of tent cities all across America. It could get very ugly, especially if you combine a food supply collapse and starvation and stock market collapse, monetary problems, all these things. There are scenarios here that get exponentially worse because the failures feed on the other failures, and it becomes a self-reinforcing feedback loop of collapse, Ponzi style. And there are many ways in which our society right now has been so highly over-leveraged that some of the elements of collapse will, in fact, multiply adjacent elements of collapse. These are known in complex systems, by the way, as emergent properties that usually cannot be properly simulated by any human being or even computer simulations, because they can't really take into account all of the subtleties of interactions among the elements of complex systems. And in fact, this is why there is no perfect computer to predict what's going to happen in the stock market, because it's a complex system. This is also why there's no perfect drug to cure some disease, because the human body is a complex system with very complex interactions and emergent properties and unexpected cascading events and things like that are not well understood. If anything, what we need to learn from this is that we should be more humble as human beings, that humanity, we don't know as much as we think we do. We haven't built a society that's as strong as we like to imagine. In fact, it's very fragile, and it can collapse literally overnight with a bank freeze, for example, or a food supply failure, or a solar flare, take out the power grid. What if another black swan event like that happens in the middle of all this? Then where are we? We're basically reduced to a third world existence virtually overnight. So these are just some important things to think about, folks. My job is to bring you these kinds of analyses and provoke you to think critically about what's going on, not to be your friend, not to run for office and get your vote, not to be your buddy, not to win any popularity awards, but to help you stay alive, to help you navigate this. That's what I do at Natural News. And if you want to support my work, by the way, shop at my online store, healthrangerstore.com, where we use good, solid science, a multi-million-dollar laboratory to run analytical testing of all the food and supplements that we sell. We test them for heavy metals, microbiology, pesticides, and by the way, we are now purchasing, this is awesome, GMO testing, PCR equipment, gene sequencing platforms. I was in a meeting this morning with the techs and the sales reps from that so that we can build our own custom libraries for adding a plant identity analysis and so on. So our lab, the Health Ranger Lab, is going to be a genetics lab soon, on top of the pesticides and the mass spec instruments and the ICP-MS, heavy metals analysis. We're going to be testing for GMOs ourselves, because I don't trust any other labs. I don't trust any labs. I've seen too much fakery out there. So I had to build a lab in order to do the tests that I want for the foods and products that we sell. And so if you want the cleanest food in the world that's been subjected to the most aggressive, scrutinized testing of anything in the world, that's healthrangerstore.com. That's my store. And the way that you hear me talk about the coronavirus and the math and the science and the projections, that's the way I approach food contamination as well. I'm a bit of a clean food fanatic, you might say. That's probably a pretty accurate description. I'm fanatical about clean food, and I love to run science instruments and test things and make sure they're clean, because of course I take them myself. And you don't want contaminants in this dirty, polluted world. It's dirty enough as it is. You don't want toxic supplements going into your body, polluting your brain even more, given everything else that's going on out there. So clean food, I thank you for your support. That will help fund us and keep us going so that I can bring you more analyses like the one that I just did here. healthrangerstore.com. This is Mike Adams. Thank you for your support. I pray that you join me in surviving all of this, because there will be light on the other side of all this. I just don't know the duration of the darkness, but there will be light on the other side. Thank you for listening. When it comes to prepping, you not only need good products that can help keep you alive, awake, aware, and nourished during difficult times, you also need products you can trust. At the Health Ranger store, we do extensive laboratory testing using an in-house lab that's ISO accredited. It's inspected, it's audited. It's a 2-year process to even get that accreditation. We use multiple mass spec instruments, state-of-the-art science. I'm a published science author as well, and a patent holder on several technologies, some of which we use variations of in our lab. The purpose of this lab is to help you make sure you get clean foods, superfoods, storable foods for emergency preparedness and survival use. We have a certified organic lab-tested, what's called Ranger Bucket collection of storable foods with some survival gear in the buckets to help you even boil water and cook those foods and so on. It's a fantastic product. We can barely keep it in stock even during normal times. In a crisis, we'll be wiped out of this product because it actually takes us a lot of time to make those products. But if they're in stock, you can get them now at healthrangerstore.com/prepwithmike. In fact, go to that URL, healthrangerstore.com/prepwithmike, and you'll see some of our survival and preparedness supplies, including iodine, colloidal silver products and gel first aid products, storable foods, superfoods, medicinal herbs for first aid, and much more. We have a lot of products for you to help you be self-reliant, to be safe, to survive difficult circumstances, natural disasters, and all kinds of things. If you want to get prepared, do it with us at the Health Ranger store so that you know you're getting safe, clean, laboratory-verified preparedness foods, supplements, and other related products. Again, the URL is healthrangerstore.com/prepwithmike. All one word, no spaces. Prep with Mike. I'm Mike Adams. Thank you for your support.